Honestly, I'm just so tired of these neighborhood dictators thinking a laminated neon pink citation gives them the right to literally cook people alive in their own homes. It's exactly this kind of petty, brain-dead overreach that made me start sovereign justice in the first place, because someone has to show these people that the actual law doesn't care about their beige aesthetic. Let's just dive into it.
Have you ever sweat so much you genuinely considered filing for maritime law? Because that's where I was at. It was August in Boca Raton, Florida. If you've never experienced an August in Boca, imagine walking into a dog's mouth while wearing a wool sweater. The air doesn't just feel hot. It feels heavy. It feels malicious. It sits on your chest and dares you to try and breathe. It's the kind of heat that makes the asphalt shimmer and turns the inside of your car into a convection oven capable of roasting a Thanksgiving turkey in under 20 minutes. My house, a perfectly fine, oppressively beige stucco box in the prestigious Whispering Pines subdivision, was currently sitting at a crisp, completely unacceptable 89 degrees indoors. Why? Because my central air conditioning unit, on a massive rusted metal box that looked like it had survived the Korean War, had finally given up the ghost. It didn't just break. It died with a dramatic, screeching, metallic death rattle at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The HVAC guy, a saint named Dave who smelled entirely of Freon and despair, had come out the next morning. He took one look at the rusted coils, sighed deeply, and handed me an estimate for $8,000. $8,000. I didn't have $8,000 lying around. What I did have was $300, a functioning credit card, and a desperate, primal need to not melt into a puddle on my imitation hardwood floors. So I did what any rational, financially strapped human being would do. I drove down to the big box hardware store, fought an elderly woman for the last remaining 12,000 BTU Frigidaire window unit, and hauled that beautiful boxy salvation back to my house. I shoved it into the front living room window. Was it elegant? No. Did it match the mid-century modern aesthetic of my meticulously curated living room? Absolutely not. But within 20 minutes, it was blasting a stream of glorious, ice-cold, Freon-laced air directly onto my face. I sat on the couch in my underwear, eating a frozen waffle straight out of the box, and felt like a king. That feeling lasted exactly 24 hours. The next afternoon, I walked out to my front porch to grab the mail. The heat hit me like a physical punch. But that wasn't the worst part. Taped to my front door, fluttering slightly in the stagnant, humid breeze, was a piece of paper. It was neon pink. In the world of Whispering Pines, so neon pink means only one thing. The Homeowners Association has found you guilty of existing incorrectly. I peeled the tape off the wood, already feeling my blood pressure spike. I didn't even need to look at the signature at the bottom. I knew exactly who it was from. Richard. Richard was the HOA president. He was a man who looked like he had been born wearing a pastel polo shirt tucked tightly into khaki shorts. He was the kind of guy who probably measured his lawn with a plastic ruler and called the cops if a teenager rode a skateboard too aggressively down the sidewalk. His entire identity was wrapped up in enforcing the 72-page document known as the Whispering Pines Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. I read the pink slip. Citation notice. Property, 402 Cypress Lane. Violation, Bylaw 14B. No supplemental cooling devices, including but not limited to window air conditioning units, shall be visible from the street. Remedy required. Immediate removal. Fine. $100 per day until compliance is met. I stared at the paper. I looked at the window. The Frigidaire was sitting there, humming happily, doing exactly what it was designed to do, keeping me from dying of heat stroke. I crumpled the paper in my fist. $100 a day? For trying to survive a Florida summer? It was extortion. Pure bureaucratic extortion. I marched down the driveway, the hot concrete burning through the soles of my flip-flops. I was going to find Richard. I didn't have to look far. He was 3 houses down, driving his pristine white golf cart at exactly 4 miles per hour, inspecting a neighbor's mailbox for unauthorized rust. "Richard!" I yelled, waving the crumpled pink ball of paper. He stopped the golf cart. He slowly turned his head. He had those expensive, rimless sunglasses that made him look like a low-level Bond villain. He smiled, and it was the most infuriating, condescending smile I had ever seen. "Ah," Richard said, his voice dripping with faux politeness. "Good afternoon. I see you received my note." "Your note?" I marched up to the side of the golf cart. "Richard, it's 100 degrees out here. My central AC is dead. It's going to take weeks for me to save up to replace it. I have a window unit so I don't literally cook in my own living room." Richard sighed, reaching into the cup holder of his cart to adjust a laminated binder. "I understand your predicament. Truly, I do. It is unseasonably warm." "It's Florida in August, Richard." "Oh, it's exactly as warm as it's supposed to be." "Regardless," he continued, tapping the binder with a manicured fingernail, "the bylaws are very clear. Bylaw 14B. We cannot have window units protruding from the fronts of our homes. It degrades the visual harmony of the neighborhood. It brings down property values. It looks trashy." "Trashy?" I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You know what brings down property values? Finding a mummified homeowner in their living room because the HOA wouldn't let them have a fan." Richard's smile vanished. His jaw tightened. "The rules are the rules. You signed the agreement when you bought the house. Remove the unit by tomorrow morning, or the fines will begin. Good day." He pressed the accelerator on his little electric cart and hummed away down the street, and leaving me standing in a cloud of dust and oppressive heat. I walked back to my house, furious. I walked inside, stood in front of the window unit, and let the cold air wash over me. I smoothed out the crumpled pink paper. I read it again. And then I read it one more time. "No supplemental cooling devices shall be visible from the street." I stopped. I read it aloud. "Shall be visible from the street." It didn't say I couldn't have a window unit. It didn't say window units were banned from the property entirely. It said they couldn't be visible from the street. A slow, deeply malicious smile spread across my face. If Richard wanted visual harmony, I was going to give him the most harmonious, aesthetically pleasing middle finger he had ever seen. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. "Buzz," I said when the line picked up. "Who's dead? And how deep do we need to dig the hole?" a gruff, gravelly voice answered. Buzz was a local general contractor, handyman, and self-proclaimed anarchist. He drove a battered Ford F-250 that held more power tools than a Home Depot, smoked 2 packs of cheap cigarettes a day, and harbored a deep, burning hatred for homeowners' associations that rivaled my own. "Nobody's dead yet," I said. "But my HOA just declared war on my air conditioner. I need a favor, a weird one." "My favorite kind," Buzz grunted. "I'll be there in 10. True to his word, Buzz's truck came rattling up my driveway 12 minutes later, blasting classic rock, and trailing a faint cloud of exhaust. He hopped out, a lit cigarette dangling precariously from his bottom lip, and he was wearing cargo shorts covered in paint stains and a faded t-shirt that said, "I can fix it, but I can't fix stupid." "All right, what's the damage?" he asked, walking up to the front porch. I handed him the pink citation. Buzz read it, took a long drag of his cigarette, and blew the smoke out his nose. "Visible from the street," Buzz muttered, zeroing in on the exact same phrase I had. He looked up at the window unit jutting out from my living room. "Well, that's a problem." "Not if we hide it," I said. Buzz raised an eyebrow. "Hide it? With what? A tarp? They'll fine you for having a tarp." "No," I said, pulling out my phone and opening the Whispering Pines HOA resident portal. I went through the flora and fauna approved landscaping list. We are allowed to plant bushes in front of our windows. Specifically, they highly recommend the Ficus benjamina for its lush tropical appearance and excellent screening capabilities. Buzz stared at me. "You want me to plant a tree in front of your AC unit?" "No, Buzz. If we plant a real tree, it'll take years to grow and the AC will suffocate. I want you to build me a box. A highly breathable wire mesh enclosure that goes completely over the air conditioner." Buzz was starting to grin. "And then?" "And then we cover that box in the most realistic, UV-resistant synthetic Ficus benjamina foliage money can buy. I want to make that appliance wear a ghillie suit. I want it to look like a perfectly manicured, HOA-approved piece of landscaping, a bush that just happens to occasionally drip condensation." Buzz let out a loud barking laugh. He tossed his cigarette onto the driveway and crushed it with his boot. "You're a madman. It's going to restrict the airflow. It'll run hot." "Can we build it so it breathes?" "I can build anything," Buzz said, already pulling a tape measure out of his pocket. "We use a wide-gauge chicken wire for the frame. Zip-tie the fake leaves to it. Leave the bottom entirely open for intake, and make sure the front exhaust vent has a clear path through the plastic leaves. It won't be perfect, but it'll run." We spent the next 3 hours at the craft store and the hardware store. We bought 50 feet of green-coated chicken wire, industrial zip ties, and roughly $400 worth of premium artificial ficus branches. By sunset, my front yard looked like a staging area for a very confusing military operation. "All right, hold that corner," Buzz grunted, his forearms covered in scratches from the wire. We wrestled the custom-built wireframe box over the window unit. It fit perfectly. Then began the tedious process of weaving the synthetic branches through the wire. We worked under the glow of my porch light, zip-tying, twisting, and arranging. "Make sure you cover the brand name," I instructed, handing him another plastic branch. "If Richard sees the word Frigidaire shining through the leaves, we're busted." "Relax, Picasso. I'm blending the foliage," Buzz said, snipping a zip tie. By 11 p.m., we stepped back to admire our work. It was, quite frankly, a masterpiece of malicious engineering. Unless you were standing 12 inches away, you would never know there was a heavy-duty household appliance hiding inside it. It looked exactly like a dense, imperfectly trimmed rectangular bush sitting right beneath my front window. We even scattered some cedar mulch on the ground below it to complete the illusion. I went inside and turned the unit on. The fake leaves rustled gently as the cold air blasted into my living room. I walked back outside. You could hear a low hum, but in the ambient noise of a Florida summer night, the cicadas, the distant traffic, it completely blended in. "Buzz," I said, handing him a cold beer from my fridge. "You are an artist." "I'm a visionary," he corrected, cracking the beer open. "Let's see what Dick Chard has to say about this." We didn't have to wait long. The next morning, at exactly 9 a.m., The slow, whining hum of an electric golf cart echoed down Cypress Lane. I was sitting in my living room, sipping iced coffee in my 68-degree sanctuary, was watching through the blinds. Richard pulled up to the curb in front of my house. He stopped the cart. He had his clipboard resting on his steering wheel. He looked at my front window. He blinked. He took off his rimless sunglasses and wiped them on his polo shirt. He put them back on. He squinted. The window unit was gone. In its place was a lush, vibrant green bush. I watched as Richard slowly got out of the cart. He walked up my driveway, his eyes locked on the synthetic foliage. He knew something was wrong. He could probably feel the unnatural chill radiating from the plant. He stopped about 5 feet away, leaning in, trying to peer through the plastic leaves. I couldn't resist. I opened the front door and stepped out, holding my coffee mug. "Morning, Richard," I called out cheerfully. Richard jumped slightly, clearly startled, but he recovered his composure, standing up straight and clearing his throat. "Good morning. I see you've removed the unauthorized cooling device." "I did," I lied smoothly. "You were right. The rules are the rules. I decided to focus on my landscaping instead, beautifying the neighborhood just like Bylaw 14B intended." Richard stared at the bush. The compressor kicked on inside, and the entire fake plant vibrated aggressively for a second before settling into a steady hum. Richard pointed a trembling finger at it. That bush is vibrating." "Florida wildlife," I said without missing a beat. "Probably a large iguana in there. They love the Ficus benjamina. Very lush." Richard knew I was lying. I knew he knew I was lying. But he had a problem. He was a creature of bureaucracy, so he couldn't issue a citation without a provable violation. From the street, and even from the driveway, it looked like a plant, an approved plant. He scowled, his face turning a blotchy shade of pink. He looked at the clipboard, looked at the vibrating bush, and then looked at me. "I will be watching you," Richard hissed. "Enjoy the view," I replied, taking a loud sip of my coffee. Richard marched back to his golf cart, threw it in reverse, and sped off as fast as the electric motor would carry him. I walked back inside, shut the door, and laughed until my ribs hurt. I had won. I had beaten the system using their own stupid rules against them. Or so I thought, because what I hadn't accounted for was the laws of thermodynamics. For the first 3 days, I was convinced Buzz and I were literal geniuses. I mean, honestly, we had beaten the system. The neighborhood was dead quiet. Richard hadn't been back, and my living room was a frosty, magnificent sanctuary. I was walking around in a hoodie in the middle of August, entirely fueled by spite and iced coffee. But then the heat wave hit. And when I say heat wave, I don't mean it got a little uncomfortable. I mean the local news anchors started looking panicked. The temperature spiked to 104 degrees, and the humidity was so dense you could basically swim to your mailbox. The air was stagnant, thick, and oppressive. My little Frigidaire was fighting for its life. I could hear it working from the kitchen, a low, desperate, rumbling hum that sounded like a prop plane trying to take off. Because here's the thing about air conditioners. They need to breathe. They work by pulling the heat out of your house and exhausting it outside. And while Buzz had done his best to make our synthetic Ficus benjamina breathable, it was still, fundamentally, a plastic box wrapped in more plastic. It started on a Thursday afternoon. I was sitting on the couch, watching TV, when I noticed a smell. It wasn't smoke, not at first. It was this weird, cloyingly sweet chemical odor. It smelled like somebody was microwaving a Tupperware container full of cheap hairspray. I paused the TV. I sniffed the air. The smell was definitely coming from the window. I walked over and put my hand against the glass. The glass itself was hot. Not warm. Hot. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The heat hit me, but underneath the normal Florida swamp air was a concentrated toxic wave of melting polyurethane. I looked down at my masterpiece. The bush was no longer a vibrant, lush green. It was starting to droop. The leaves right in front of the exhaust vent weren't just wilting. They were curling inward, melting into sad, shiny little green puddles of plastic. By melting, they were fusing together, creating a solid, impenetrable wall of plastic that was violently trapping all the exhaust heat directly inside the wire cage. The compressor sounded like it was screaming. It was a high-pitched metallic whine that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. "Oh no," I muttered. "No, no, no." I rushed forward to try and pull the wire cage off, but the metal was searing hot. I jumped back, shaking my burned fingers. And that's when the compressor finally lost its mind. There was a loud pop, followed by a shower of orange sparks shooting out of the side vent. One of those sparks landed directly on the decorative, highly flammable cedar mulch Buzz had so thoughtfully scattered around the base of the unit to complete the illusion. The mulch instantly caught fire. The flames licked upward, catching the drooping, melting plastic leaves. Let me tell you, artificial ficus foliage is apparently coated in some sort of petroleum-based nightmare because it didn't just burn, it accelerated. Within 10 seconds, my beautiful, spiteful shrubbery was a roaring, smoking, 3-foot-tall bonfire of toxic black smoke and melting green plastic. "Fire!" I yelled, like an absolute idiot, to exactly nobody. I turned around to run for the garden hose, but as I yanked it off the wall, it snagged. Just by the time I untangled the stupid green rubber hose and turned the spigot on, the sirens were already wailing in the distance. Someone, and I guarantee you it was Richard, probably watching my house through tactical binoculars from his living room, had called 911. The fire itself wasn't actually threatening the house. The stucco and the concrete patio were entirely fireproof, and the flames were contained strictly to the wire cage and the mulch. But it looked terrifying. Thick, oily black smoke was billowing up into the clear blue Florida sky, staining the side of my pristine beige house with a thick layer of soot. A massive red fire truck came screaming around the corner of Cypress Lane. Air horn blasting, followed closely by a Boca Raton police cruiser. My neighbors were pouring out of their houses, standing on their manicured lawns, muscle pointing and whispering. 2 firefighters in full turnout gear practically leapt off the truck before it even completely stopped. They unspooled a hose, took one look at the flaming, melting cube on my front porch, and hit it with a blast of water. The fire died instantly in a massive, hissing cloud of white steam. I stood there in my driveway, holding my pathetic green garden hose, dripping with sweat, watching the steam clear. What remained was a tragedy. It was a blackened, melted wire mesh skeleton. Blobs of hardened green plastic clung to the rusted, charred remains of my window unit. The Frigidaire was dead, murdered by its own disguise. The firefighters were poking the wreckage with a pike pole, looking incredibly confused. A police officer walked up my driveway. He was wiping sweat from his forehead, was looking like a man who was deeply, fundamentally exhausted by the general public. His name tag read Martinez. "Afternoon," Officer Martinez said, his voice flat. He looked at me, then at the charred wire cage, then back at me. "Can you explain to me what exactly caught fire here?" I swallowed hard. "I mean, technically my air conditioner." Martinez took out a small notepad. He clicked his pen. Your air conditioner. Okay. And why was your air conditioner wrapped in chicken wire and… what is that, melted plastic? It was a bush, I said quietly. Martinez stopped writing. He looked up at me, his eyes dead. It was a bush. A synthetic Ficus benjamina, I clarified, desperately wanting the ground to open up and swallow me, to comply with HOA landscaping regulations. Martinez stared at me for a long, agonizing 10 seconds. What he looked over at the firefighters, who were now openly laughing as they realized what they were looking at. He looked back at me. So, let me get this straight, Martinez said, pinching the bridge of his nose. You disguised a Frigidaire as a shrubbery to spite your homeowners association? Allegedly, I said. Martinez let out a breath that was half laugh, half sigh. Look, man, I'm not writing you a ticket for this. It's not illegal to be stupid on your own property, provided you don't burn the neighborhood down. But the fire chief is very confused. Your AC is completely fried and… He paused, pointing a finger over my shoulder. I'm pretty sure that guy in the golf cart is about to have a stroke. I turned around. Richard was parked at the end of my driveway. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't smug. He was glowing with a radiant, just terrifying bureaucratic fury. He had his clipboard gripped so tightly his knuckles were white. Martinez patted my shoulder. Good luck with that. Don't build any more plastic bushes. The fire truck packed up and left. The police cruiser rolled away. The neighbors slowly went back inside, thoroughly entertained. And I was left standing in front of my house, staring at Richard, with the smell of burned plastic hanging in the heavy air. Richard didn't say a word. He just furiously scribbled something on his clipboard, ripped the top sheet off, marched up my driveway, slapped the paper directly onto my chest, turned around, and drove away. I looked down at the paper. It was an emergency summons. I was being hauled in front of the HOA board. The meeting was scheduled for the next evening at the community clubhouse. As the clubhouse was heavily air-conditioned, which felt like a deliberate psychological attack, considering my house was currently sitting at 92 degrees. I sat in a rigid folding chair at the center of the room. Across from me sat the HOA board, a tribunal of 5 retirees who viewed themselves as the Supreme Court of Whispering Pines. Richard sat in the center, flanked by 2 women who looked like they permanently smelled sour, and 2 men who seemed like they were just there for the free donuts. This meeting will come to order, Richard announced, banging a literal wooden gavel on the plastic folding table. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. We are here to address the catastrophic, reckless, and frankly insulting behavior of the resident at 402 Cypress Lane. It was an accident, I said, leaning forward. The unit overheated. Because you encased it in a highly flammable, unauthorized structure, Richard barked. He pulled a stack of photographs from his folder and slammed them onto the table. They were glossy 8 by 10 prints of the charred wire mesh skeleton sitting on my patio. He had hired someone to take professional crime scene photos of my melted AC. I encased it in a structure that met the exact visual requirements of Bylaw 14b, I shot back. You forced me to hide it. I hid it. The fact that it combusted is an unfortunate consequence of your ridiculous aesthetic standards. The board gasped. One of the sour-looking women clutched invisible pearls. Richard's face turned an ugly shade of magenta. You are out of line. You created a fire hazard that required emergency services to enter our gated community. You have damaged the exterior stucco of your home with soot, violating the exterior maintenance clause. And you still have an unauthorized, albeit destroyed, cooling device on your property. He picked up his clipboard. This was it. the execution. "The board has voted," Richard said, his voice dropping into a deadly, bureaucratic monotone. "You are hereby fined $500 for the creation of a severe safety hazard. You are fined an additional $500 for unauthorized hazardous yard art, referring to the charred remains. You will pay a $200 pressure washing fee to clean the soot off the HOA-owned exterior-facing wall, and you will remove the destroyed unit immediately." $1,200? I asked, my voice cracking slightly. I felt sick. "Oh, we're not finished." Richard smiled. Instead, it was a terrible, thin-lipped smile. "Because you intentionally attempted to circumvent the bylaws with your little stunt. The board is imposing a punitive fine of $1,300, bringing your total to $2,500, payable within 48 hours. The room went completely silent. I just stared at him. $2,500. I couldn't even afford the central AC repair, let alone this. "And if I don't pay it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Richard leaned over the table, clasping his hands together. "If you fail to remit payment in full within 48 hours, the Homeowners Association will immediately place a lien on your property. And 30 days after that, we will initiate foreclosure proceedings to recoup the debt. We will take your house." He wasn't bluffing. But in Florida, HOAs have terrifying amounts of power. They can and will foreclose on your home for unpaid fines. I had tried to play a cute game of malicious compliance, and Richard had responded with the nuclear option. "You have 48 hours, Richard said, banging the gavel again. "Meeting adjourned." I walked home in a daze. The sun had gone down, but the heat hadn't broken. My house felt like the inside of a closed mouth. I walked into the living room, stripping off my sweat-soaked shirt, and slumped onto the couch in the dark. Through the window, I could see the blackened silhouette of the wire cage. I was completely, utterly screwed. I didn't have the money. I didn't have the AC. I was going to lose my house because I tried to hide a Frigidaire in a fake bush. I felt a crushing wave of despair wash over me. And I literally put my head in my hands and groaned. They had beaten me. Richard had won. The petty tyranny of the HOA was absolute, and there was absolutely no way out of the corner I had painted myself into. I pulled out my phone. The screen cast a harsh blue light in the dark, suffocating room. I don't even know what I was looking for. A miracle? A pro bono lawyer who specialized in shrubbery-related real estate disputes? I opened Google. I typed in, "Can an HOA ban window air conditioners?" The results were depressing. Yes, they can. Yes, they do. Courts routinely uphold HOA architectural guidelines. I scrolled past page after page of legal forums where depressed homeowners accepted their sweaty, miserable fates. I was about to throw the phone across the room when I saw a related search query at the very bottom of the page. "Are there any devices an HOA cannot ban?" I clicked it. I honestly didn't expect much. Maybe a flag. Maybe a specific type of mailbox. But what I saw on that page made me sit straight up in the dark. My heart started beating faster. I clicked the link, taking me directly to a federal government website. I started reading. I read it once. I read it twice. I read it a third time, my eyes scanning the dense, bureaucratic legal text. A slow, chaotic, absolutely manic smile spread across my face. I didn't just have a loophole. I had a federal mandate. I had a weapon so legally bulletproof that Richard's little 72-page rule book was about to become completely, entirely irrelevant. I looked at the time. It was 11:30 p.m. I didn't care. I hit Buzz's contact and pressed call. He answered on the second ring, and sounding wide awake and surrounded by the noise of power tools. "Tell me you didn't burn the house down," he grunted. "Buzz," I said, my voice shaking with adrenaline. "I need you back here tomorrow morning, first thing." "Did they fine you?" "They fined me $2.5 grand and threatened to foreclose on my house," I said. Buzz let out a low whistle. "Damn. So what's the plan? We burying Richard in the Everglades?" "No," I laughed, a genuine, slightly unhinged laugh. "We're going to build a new air conditioning unit. A bigger one. The biggest, most obnoxious, loudest, most visible metal box you can find. And we are going to mount it directly in the front window." "They'll tow your house away, kid." "They can't," I said, staring at the glowing federal website on my phone. "Because it's not going to be an air conditioner anymore, Buzz. It's going to be a federally protected telecommunications mast." Buzz pulled into my driveway the next morning at exactly 7 a.m., the Florida sun already threatening to turn the neighborhood into a steam room. He stepped out of his truck holding 2 massive iced coffees and a look of deep, skeptical concern. Honestly, I must have looked like a maniac. I hadn't slept. I had dark circles under my eyes. I was vibrating with a mix of caffeine and pure, unadulterated legal adrenaline, and I was standing in my doorway holding a stack of freshly printed, heavily highlighted papers. "All right, federal communications expert," Buzz grunted, handing me a coffee. "Talk to me. Because I like sticking it to the man as much as the next guy. But I don't want to go to federal prison for building an illegal radio tower in a gated community." I took a long, desperate sip of the coffee and slammed the papers down on my kitchen counter. "Buzz, we aren't building an illegal radio tower. We are building a federally protected fixed wireless internet reception station, and we are going to use an air conditioner to do it." I smoothed out the top page. It was a printout directly from the Federal Communications Commission. "Okay, look. It's called the FCCOT-ARD rule, Over-the-Air Reception Devices. Congress passed it in the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and they've updated it since then to include broadband internet." Buzz squinted at the paper, taking a drag of his cigarette. "And? What does 1996 have to do with Richard trying to steal your house in 2026? "Everything," I said, literally tapping the paper so hard my finger hurt. "The OTARD rule specifically prohibits homeowners associations, local governments, and landlords from restricting the installation, maintenance, or use of antennas used to receive video programming or fixed wireless signals. It completely, 100% preempts local HOA rules. If Richard's little rulebook conflicts with the FCC wins. Flawless victory." Buzz leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Okay, so you can put an antenna on your roof. Great. You still don't have AC, and you owe them $2.5 grand. "Keep reading," I said, grinning like an absolute lunatic. "Look at the definition of what is protected." Buzz read the highlighted section aloud, his raspy voice stumbling over the legalese. "The rule applies to the antenna, and to the mast, cabling, and supports necessary for the proper installation and use of the antenna." "Okay. So?" "So," I said, leaning closer. "What is a mast, Buzz?" "A pole. A mounting bracket. A structure that holds the antenna." "Exactly. A structure that holds the antenna. The FCC rule explicitly states that an HOA cannot enforce any rule that would unreasonably delay or prevent installation, maintenance, or use of the protected device. If they make you move the mast or take down the mast, and it degrades your signal or costs you extra money, they are violating federal law. Buzz slowly took the cigarette out of his mouth. A huge, terrifying smile spread across his face as the realization hit him. You want me to bolt an internet antenna to an air conditioner? I want the air conditioner to be the mast, I corrected him. I want that heavy metal, a beautiful box of Freon to become the absolute, structurally necessary foundational support for my new high-speed broadband connection. If Richard tries to make me remove the AC unit, he is forcing me to dismantle a federally protected communications mast. He'll be interfering with federal telecommunications infrastructure. Buzz started laughing. It started as a low chuckle and evolved into a full-blown, wheezing cackle. You are a sick, beautiful genius. Let's go shopping. We spent the next 4 hours executing the greatest, most legally bulletproof trap in the history of Whispering Pines. First, we hit the big box hardware store. We didn't just buy a replacement for the melted Frigidaire. We bought a massive 15,000 BTU, industrial-looking LG window unit. It was unapologetically loud, incredibly metallic, and visually aggressive. It looked less like an appliance and more like a piece of Soviet-era military hardware. Next, we went to a specialty electronics supplier. I signed up for a fixed wireless residential broadband plan, which I legitimately needed anyway because my current internet provider was garbage, and bought a heavy-duty directional outdoor antenna. It looked like a sleek, white, plastic diamond. By noon, we were back at my sweltering house. The charred remains of the fake bush had been unceremoniously shoved into a trash bag. All right, Buzz said, wiping a mixture of sweat and grease off his forehead. If this is going to hold up legally, it can't just look like a hack job. The antenna actually has to work, and the AC unit actually has to be the primary structural support. No zip ties this time. Do it right, I agreed. Buzz went to work. And, honestly, it was like watching an artist paint with power tools. He carefully drilled directly into the reinforced steel outer chassis of the new AC unit, avoiding the internal coils and compressor. He used heavy-duty galvanized steel bolts to attach a solid mounting bracket right to the top of the air conditioner's housing. Then, we heaved the massive AC unit into the window. We secured it to the window frame. Finally, Buzz climbed a stepladder and locked the sleek white broadband antenna into the bracket bolted to the top of the AC. He ran the coaxial cable neatly down the side, through the weather stripping, and into my living room router. I booted up the computer, ran a speed test, and watched the needle jump to 300 megabits per second. "We have a signal!" I yelled out the window. Buzz stepped back, admiring his handiwork. There, jutting out from my front window, completely and totally visible to the street, the sidewalk, and God himself, was a giant, humming metal air conditioner, proudly serving as the immovable pedestal for a federal communications device. "It's hideous," Buzz said, wiping a tear from his eye. "I love it." "I guess now we just wait for the executioner," I said, turning on the AC. Cold air blasted into my face. I didn't care if I only had it for a few hours. I was going to enjoy it. The 48-hour deadline was up the next afternoon at 3 p.m. I literally spent the entire morning pacing my frosty living room, watching the street through the blinds. I had a manila folder sitting on my coffee table containing the printed FCCOTARD regulations, my new internet service contract, and a highlighted printout of the FCC's enforcement penalties for HOAs. At 2:55 p.m., the enemy arrived. It wasn't just Richard this time. He had brought an entourage. His white golf cart pulled up, followed closely by a rusty, unmarked pickup truck driven by the two board members who looked like they were just there for the donuts. They were wearing work gloves. Richard had brought muscle to physically rip the AC out of my window. I took a deep breath, grabbed my manila folder, and walked out the front door. The Florida heat slammed into me, but I barely felt it. I was practically floating on a cloud of vindictive energy. Richard was already standing in my driveway, his clipboard tucked under his arm, staring in absolute, sputtering horror at the window. What is that?" Richard demanded, pointing a trembling finger at the massive LG unit and the antenna bolted to its roof. "Afternoon, Richard," I said, casually leaning against one of the pillars on my porch. "It's a hot one today, isn't it?" "I gave you an order!" Richard screamed, his face turning that familiar shade of blotchy magenta. He turned to the two guys in the pickup truck. "Pull that eyesore out of the window. Do it now. The HOA is foreclosing on this property." The two guys grabbed some tools from the truck bed and started walking toward my window. "I wouldn't touch that if I were you," I said, my voice dropping the conversational tone entirely. It was flat, hard, and loud enough to make the two guys stop in their tracks. "You don't dictate terms here," Richard yelled, stepping forward. "You owe us $2,500. What you failed to comply with the architectural guidelines. We are repossessing the appliance and placing a lien on your home." "Touch that bracket," I said, pointing directly at the metal rig Buzz had bolted to the AC. "And you are committing a federal offense." That made everyone freeze. The two lackeys looked at Richard. Richard looked at me, his eyes wide with confusion and rage. "What kind of sovereign citizen nonsense are you trying to pull?" "No nonsense, Richard. Just federal law." I opened the manila folder and pulled out the thick stack of papers. I walked down the driveway and shoved them directly into Richard's chest. He instinctively grabbed them. "What is this?" he scoffed, trying to hand them back. "That is a printout of the Federal Communications Commission's OTARD rules," I said, stepping back so he had to hold them. "Telecommunications Act of 1996, updated for broadband internet. It states, unequivocally, that an HOA cannot ban, restrict, or fine a resident for installing a fixed wireless antenna." "I don't care about your antenna," Richard shrieked, spittle flying from his lips. "I care about the air conditioner." "They are the same thing, Richard," I said smoothly. "Read page 3, highlighted in yellow. The federal protection extends to the mast and the structural support system necessary for the use of the antenna. That air conditioner is not just an appliance, it is the structural mast for my broadband connection. It is permanently bolted to it. Removing that air conditioner would unreasonably delay, prevent, and financially penalize my access to a federally protected communication signal." Richard stared at me. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked down at the papers. He read the yellow highlighted text. I watched his eyes scan back and forth. This is a loophole," he stammered, his voice suddenly very quiet. "This is a trick." "It's not a trick. It's the law," I said. "And if you look at the last page, you'll see the FCC's enforcement history. When HOAs violate the OTARD rule, the FCC doesn't send a polite letter. They issue fines. Massive, crippling, federal fines, usually starting around $10,000 to $15,000 per violation." I took a step closer to him, lowering my voice so only he and the two goons could hear me. "So here is what is going to happen, Richard. You are going to waive the $2,500 in fines you levied against me yesterday, because those fines were applied to a federally protected structure. And if you don't, I will file a formal petition with the FCC this afternoon. And when the federal government comes knocking, demanding 15 grand for interfering with their telecommunications grid, I just have one question for you. I paused, letting the silence stretch out over the sweltering driveway. Are you going to pay that federal fine out of your own personal checking account? Or are you going to drain the HOA's reserve fund and explain to the entire neighborhood why their dues just tripled? The silence was deafening. The only sound was the beautiful, loud, metallic hum of my 15,000 BTU air conditioner blasting cold air into my living room. Richard looked at the papers. He looked at the window unit. He looked at the antenna. The color completely drained from his face. He wasn't a powerful dictator anymore. He was just a sweaty, middle-aged man in a pastel polo shirt who had just brought a plastic clipboard to a federal gunfight. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He slowly handed the papers back to me. He turned around, walked back to his golf cart, and sat down heavily in the vinyl seat. He didn't even look at the two guys from the pickup truck. He just put the cart in reverse and drove away. Slower than I had ever seen him drive before. The two lackeys awkwardly shuffled their feet, put their tools back in the truck, and drove off without making eye contact. I stood in my driveway, the oppressive Florida heat beating down on my shoulders, and I took the deepest, most satisfying breath of my life. I had won. Not just a minor victory, but a total, crushing, legally mandated surrender. I turned around, walked back into my house, and shut the door, while the air inside was a glorious, crisp 68 degrees. I sat down on my couch, opened my laptop, and connected to my brand new, blazing fast internet. And honestly, that's exactly why you always read the fine print. Because sometimes, the only way to beat petty neighborhood tyranny is to bring the full, crushing weight of the federal government crashing down on their perfectly manicured lawns. Remember to always know your rights, document everything, and never let them tell you what you can't do.